I didn't ask for what I found in that desert. I was just following a signal, a frequency that shouldn't exist, coming from a structure that had no right to be there. And when I met the being inside, when it looked into my mind and showed me what it knew about Jesus, everything I thought was solid turned to dust. This isn't about religion. Forget what they taught you in church. Forget the sermons, the prayers, the rituals. I'm talking about something that was buried. A truth so dangerous that it was never written down. A missing piece that, once you understand it, will make your entire life make sense in a way it never has before. But I have to warn you, this information has a price. It will illuminate parts of your existence you didn't know were dark, but it will also cast shadows on things you thought were light. If you're willing to confront what you've been told is absolute truth, if you're ready to confront what's been hidden for 2,000 years, then subscribe and stay with me. Because what you're about to hear has been waiting for you your whole life. What happened to David Brennan in the New Mexico desert wasn't the end of a life. It was the beginning of an awakening that had been waiting since the time of Jesus. Now, let me tell you how it all started. The signal came through on a Tuesday morning in October. David was sitting in his small workshop, a converted garage attached to his house on the outskirts of Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. The town had a strange name, won in a radio contest decades ago, and David had always found that fitting. Truth or Consequences, as if life itself was asking a question every single day. He'd been scanning the old military frequencies, something he'd done almost every morning since retiring from NASA 3 years ago. It was a habit born from decades of work, monitoring communications during rocket launches, tracking telemetry from spacecraft millions of miles away. Even now in retirement, his mind needed the structure, the routine, the predictable hum of electromagnetic waves traveling through space. But that morning, something changed. At exactly 6:47, a pattern broke through the static. It wasn't random. It wasn't interference. It was deliberate, mathematical, repeating every 37 seconds with absolute precision. David's coffee went cold in his hand as he leaned closer to the receiver, his engineer's brain immediately engaging. He grabbed a notepad and started transcribing the pattern, looking for structure, for meaning, for any recognizable protocol. It wasn't Morse code. It wasn't binary. It was something else entirely. A frequency modulation that seemed to carry information in layers, like a three-dimensional structure compressed into a one-dimensional signal. David spent the next 2 hours trying to decode it, running it through every algorithm he knew, every system he'd used during his NASA years. Nothing worked. The pattern remained beautiful, elegant, maddeningly incomprehensible. By 9 in the morning, David made a decision. He was going to find the source. He loaded his truck with equipment: portable receiver, directional antenna, GPS tracker, water bottles, a first aid kit, and out of habit he couldn't quite explain, a toolkit. The desert was unforgiving, and David had learned long ago to be prepared for anything. The signal led him west, away from the town, into the emptiness where the land turned from scrub brush to sand and rock. He drove for nearly an hour, following the strengthening signal, until the dirt road he'd been on disappeared entirely, and he was navigating by instinct and the GPS coordinates his equipment was giving him. And then, as he crested a small rise, he saw something that made him stop the truck so abruptly that equipment slid forward in the bed. There, in a shallow depression between two rocky outcroppings, was a structure. It was massive, easily the size of a 2-story house, and half of it was buried in the sand. But what made David's breath catch wasn't the size, it was the surface. The structure seemed to be made of metal, but metal unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was smooth, absolutely seamless, with no visible rivets, welds, or joints. And it reflected light in a way that seemed wrong, as if the surface was absorbing certain wavelengths and emitting others, creating a subtle shimmer that hurt to look at directly. David sat in his truck for a full 5 minutes, staring at the structure, his mind racing through possibilities. Experimental aircraft, military prototype, classified project from his NASA days that he'd never been briefed on. But none of those explanations felt right. This was something else. Something that triggered a deep, primal recognition in a part of his brain that had nothing to do with engineering or logic. He thought about turning around, driving back to town, forgetting he'd ever seen this. But even as the thought formed, he knew he wouldn't do it. Whatever this was, it had been calling to him through that signal. And David Brennan, for all his rational thinking and careful analysis, couldn't ignore that call. He stepped out of the truck. The desert air was cool, the sun not yet high enough to bring the brutal heat that would arrive by noon. David grabbed his portable receiver and a basic toolkit, more for comfort than any practical purpose, and started walking toward the structure. As he got closer, details emerged. The surface wasn't just smooth, it seemed to shift slightly, like liquid metal frozen in place, but still maintaining some quantum memory of fluidity. There were no windows, no doors, no visible seams of any kind. It was as if the entire structure had been grown rather than built. David circled it slowly, his receiver indicating that the signal was definitely coming from inside. He reached out tentatively and touched the surface. It was cool to the touch despite the morning sun, and there was a faint vibration, so subtle he might have imagined it. And then, as his palm rested against the metal, something extraordinary happened. A section of the wall directly in front of him began to dissolve. Not open, not slide away, but literally dissolve, the metal becoming translucent, then transparent, then simply not there anymore. David stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he didn't run. He stood there frozen as an opening formed in the structure's side, revealing darkness within. And then something stepped out into the light. But what David saw next would change everything he thought he knew about reality. David's first thought was that he was hallucinating. Heat stroke, despite the cool morning. Or perhaps a stroke, his brain misfiring, creating impossible images. But the being that emerged from the structure was too detailed, too consistent, too real to be a hallucination. It was tall, perhaps 7 feet, with a slender build that seemed almost fragile. Its skin, if you could call it that, was a pale gray that seemed to shift in tone depending on the angle of the light. The head was larger than a human's, with features that were both alien and strangely familiar. Large eyes, dark and depthless, regarded David with an expression he couldn't read. But what struck David most, what made his knees nearly buckle, was the sense of presence. This wasn't just a biological entity. There was an intelligence radiating from it, a consciousness so vast and complex that David felt like an insect trying to comprehend a human. And yet there was no threat, no aggression, just a calm, patient waiting. David tried to speak, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then he heard a voice, not through his ears, but directly in his mind, clear and gentle and utterly impossible. "Do not be afraid, David Brennan. I am not here to harm you. I am here because you are ready." David's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the sand, his breath coming in short gasps, his entire worldview shattering and reforming in the space of seconds. The being didn't move closer. It simply stood there waiting, as if it had all the time in the universe. "This isn't real," David managed to say aloud, his voice cracking. "This can't be real." "Your mind is trying to protect you by rejecting what it sees," the voice in his head responded. "This is normal. Take your time. Breathe. When you are ready, we will speak." David did breathe. Long, slow breaths, forcing oxygen into his lungs, forcing his heart rate to slow. He was a scientist, an engineer. He'd spent his entire adult life solving problems, analyzing data, making sense of complex systems. And right now his mind was doing what it did best. Cataloging, analyzing, trying to fit this impossible situation into some framework that made sense. After what might have been minutes or hours, David didn't know anymore. He looked up at the being and asked the only question that mattered. "What are you?" "I am a traveler," the being responded. "My kind has been observing your species for a very long time, watching, learning, waiting for moments when intervention becomes necessary." "Intervention?" David's voice was steadier now. "What kind of intervention?" "The kind that prevents a species from destroying itself before it learns the truth." The being tilted its head slightly, a gesture that seemed almost human. "Your world is approaching a critical threshold, David. You stand at a crossroads between awakening and extinction, and there are some among you who are ready to hear what was hidden. You are one of them." David felt something shift in his chest, a mixture of fear and excitement and something else he couldn't name. Hidden? What was hidden? "The second teaching," the being said simply, "the one that Jesus tried to give humanity, but the world was not ready to receive." The name hit David like a physical blow. Jesus. He hadn't thought about Jesus, really thought about him, since he was a teenager sitting in a church pew, bored and restless, waiting for the sermon to end. David's family had been casually religious, the kind that went to church on holidays and major life events, but didn't let it interfere with daily living. By the time David was in college studying engineering, he'd left all of that behind. Science had become his religion. Evidence, proof, measurable, testable reality. But now, sitting in the sand in front of an alien being, that name carried a weight he'd never felt before. And what he was about to discover would shatter everything he thought he knew about faith, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. "I don't understand," David said. "What does Jesus have to do with any of this?" "Everything," the being replied. "But before I show you, I need you to understand something fundamental. Your species has been taught that you are separate from the divine, that God is external, distant, something to be worshipped and feared and appealed to. This teaching, while it served a purpose in your early development, has become a prison. It has kept you from understanding your true nature." David's scientific mind immediately rebelled. "God? Divine nature? I don't believe in any of that." "I know," the being said, and there was something that might have been amusement in its mental voice. "You believe in physics, in cause and effect, in measurable phenomena, and that is precisely why you are ready. Because what I'm about to show you isn't mysticism, David. It's science, consciousness science, the physics of thought and reality. Jesus understood this, he tried to teach it, but the world heard religion instead of instruction." The being gestured toward the opening in the structure. "Come inside, I will show you what was never written down. The second covenant. The teaching that would have freed humanity 2,000 years ago if they had been ready to hear it." David stood slowly, his legs still unsteady. Every rational part of his mind was screaming that this was insane, that he should run, call someone, do anything but step into that structure with an alien being. But there was another part of him, a part that had been silent for decades, that recognized this moment, that knew somehow that his entire life had been leading to this point. He walked toward the opening. The being stepped aside, allowing him to enter first, and as David crossed the threshold, as the cool darkness of the interior enveloped him, he felt something fundamental shift in his consciousness, as if he'd been living his entire life in 2 dimensions and had just stepped into 3. The interior of the structure was not what David expected. From outside, it had looked like a solid mass of metal, but inside it opened into a space that seemed impossible, far larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. The walls glowed with a soft blue-white light that had no visible source, and the air had a quality to it, a stillness as if sound itself was muted. In the center of the space was a circular platform, and hovering above it was what looked like a 3-dimensional projection, except it was more solid, more present than any hologram David had ever seen. It showed images, scenes from what looked like ancient times, but rendered with a clarity and detail that was stunning. "What is this?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A record," the being responded. "We have been documenting significant moments in your species' development. This particular record is from 2,037 years ago. Measured in your time, it is the moment when Jesus attempted to deliver the second teaching." The scene in the projection shifted, and David found himself looking at a figure he recognized from countless paintings and stained glass windows. Jesus. But this wasn't the serene, glowing figure of religious art. This was a man, maybe in his early 30s, with weathered skin and intense eyes, sitting among a small group of people in what looked like a simple stone room. "This is 3 days after the crucifixion," the being said. "Jesus has returned to his followers. But what you are about to hear was never recorded in your scriptures. It was considered too dangerous, too revolutionary, so it was buried, hidden, lost to time." David watched as the figure of Jesus began to speak, and though the language was nothing David recognized, he understood every word, as if the being was translating directly into his mind. What Jesus said next would change David's understanding of everything he thought he knew about divinity, power, and human potential. Jesus looked at his followers, and there was something in his expression that David had never seen in any religious depiction, not divinity, not otherworldly perfection, but a profound, almost desperate hope. "I have tried to show you," Jesus said, his voice tired but unwavering. "For 3 years I have demonstrated the power that lives within each of you. I have healed the sick, not through divine intervention, but through the understanding of how consciousness shapes reality. I have multiplied food, not through miracle, but through the application of creative thought manifested in the physical realm. I have walked on water not to prove I am the Son of God, but to show you that the laws you think are fixed are actually responsive to belief. One of the followers, a young man, spoke up. But Master, we are not like you. We do not have your power. And Jesus' response made David's breath catch. That is the lie that will destroy everything I have tried to teach you. You are exactly like me. Every single one of you carries the same spark, the same creative force that I have demonstrated. The only difference is that I know this truth, and you have been taught to forget it. Jesus stood pacing in the small room, his frustration evident. Listen to me carefully, because what I am about to say is the most important teaching I can give you. God is not separate from you. God is not a being sitting in heaven judging your actions. God is consciousness itself, the creative force that brings all things into existence. And you, each of you, are expressions of that consciousness, given form, given individual perspective, but never, ever separate from the source. David felt something crack open in his chest. This wasn't the Jesus of Sunday school. This wasn't the patient shepherd or the suffering Savior. This was a teacher, desperate to convey a truth that his students couldn't quite grasp. When I said I and the Father are one, Jesus continued, I was not claiming to be uniquely divine. I was stating a truth that applies to every human being who has ever lived or will ever live. You and the Father are one. You and the creative consciousness of the universe are one. There is no separation. There never has been. Another follower, an older woman, asked, Then why do we suffer? Why do we feel powerless? Because you have been taught a lie, Jesus said, and there was anguish in his voice now. You have been taught that you are small, that you are sinful, that you are separate from God and must earn your way back through obedience and sacrifice. But this teaching serves only one purpose. It keeps you powerless. It keeps you dependent. It keeps you from discovering the truth that would set you free. He knelt down, looking directly at the small group. The kingdom of God is within you. Not metaphorically, literally. The creative power of the universe exists in your consciousness. Every thought you think, every belief you hold, every emotion you feel is actively shaping your reality. You are not victims of circumstance. You are creators, whether you know it or not. David watched as Jesus placed his hand on the ground. You see the stone floor? Solid, fixed, unchanging. That is how you see reality. But I tell you, this stone is made of the same consciousness that you are. It appears solid because collective consciousness has agreed it is solid. But if you truly understood your power, if you truly believed, you could reshape this stone with a thought. You could move mountains. You could walk on water. You could heal sickness. Not because you are special, but because you finally understood what you are. Then teach us, one of the followers pleaded. Show us how. And Jesus' expression became infinitely sad. I have been trying, but you keep looking to me as if I am the source of the power. You keep praying to an external God. You keep waiting for salvation to come from outside yourselves. And until you stop doing that, until you look inward and recognize the divine spark within your own being, you will remain trapped in limitation. He stood again, and when he spoke next, his voice had a quality of finality. I am leaving soon. My time in this form is complete. But before I go, I need you to understand one thing. I did not come here to be worshipped. I did not come here to create a religion. I came here to wake you up, to remind you of what you are, to show you that the power you think belongs only to God belongs to you as well, because you are not separate from God. You never were. Jesus looked at each follower in turn. You will be tempted to make me into something I am not, to elevate me, to worship me, to build institutions around my name. And if you do that, you will miss the entire point of my teaching. I am not the destination. I am a mirror. I am here to reflect back to you what you truly are. Divine, creative, powerful beyond measure, and limited only by your belief in limitation. The projection paused, and David realized he was crying. Tears streaming down his face, his chest heaving with emotion he couldn't name. Because everything Jesus had said resonated with something deep inside him, something that had been buried under decades of scientific materialism and rational thinking. But what came next would reveal an even deeper truth, one that would change the course of David's entire life. This is what was never recorded, the being said softly. This is the second teaching, the one that would have changed everything. David wiped his eyes, trying to compose himself. Why? Why wasn't this written down? Why didn't his followers preserve this? Some tried. the being replied. There were texts, writings, accounts that contained fragments of this teaching, but they were systematically destroyed or hidden by those who came later, because this teaching is dangerous to power structures. If people truly understood that they are divine, that they carry creative power within themselves, they would no longer need priests or intermediaries. They would no longer tithe to institutions. They would no longer accept suffering as divinely ordained. They would become sovereign. The being gestured and the projection changed, showing scene after scene. Councils of religious leaders arguing over texts, books being burned, gospels being selected for inclusion or exclusion from official canon. And through it all, a pattern emerged. Anything that suggested humans had inherent divine power was removed. Anything that kept people dependent on external authority was preserved. Jesus tried to teach humanity two things, the being continued, his voice taking on a deeper resonance. The first was about trust, believe, have faith. This was necessary because your species needed to learn to trust something beyond immediate physical senses. Faith was the foundation, the first step toward understanding that reality is not limited to what you can see and touch. The projection shifted again, showing Jesus teaching crowds, healing the sick, demonstrating what appeared to be miracles. But faith was never meant to be the destination, the being said. It was meant to be a bridge, a way to transition from seeing yourself as purely physical to recognizing yourself as consciousness. And once that bridge was crossed, the second teaching was supposed to follow. The being turned to face David directly, and in that moment David felt the full weight of what was being revealed. The second teaching is this: you are not separate from the divine. You are an expression of it. God is not a being in the sky. God is consciousness itself, the creative force that brings all things into existence. And you, David Brennan, are not separate from that force. You are it, localized, individualized, given a unique point of view. David felt his knees weaken again, but this time he remained standing. So when Jesus healed people, when he performed miracles, he wasn't calling on God's power. He was using his own. He was using the power that is inherent in all consciousness, the being corrected gently. There is no his power and God's power as separate things. There is only consciousness, and Jesus understood this so completely, so deeply, that he could direct it with absolute precision. He held no doubt, no conflicting beliefs, no separation between intention and manifestation. That is why what you call miracles happened. The being moved closer to David. And this is what was buried. This is what was hidden. Because if humanity had understood this teaching, truly understood it, the world would be unrecognizable today. There would be no religions built on guilt and unworthiness, no institutions claiming authority over people's connection to the divine, no waiting for salvation from an external source, just billions of humans recognizing their own creative power and consciously shaping their reality. David's mind was reeling, trying to process the enormity of what he was hearing. But if this is true, if Jesus taught this, why did it get lost? Why didn't it survive? Because power structures depend on people believing they are powerless, the being said simply. When Jesus said the kingdom of God is within you, he was giving away the secret. He was telling people they don't need temples or priests or intermediaries. They have direct access to creative source because they are expressions of it. And for those who had built their authority on being gatekeepers to God, this teaching was intolerable. The projection showed more scenes, this time of early church councils, debates, arguments. So they did what power always does when threatened, the being continued. They changed the message. Over time, Jesus was placed so high above humanity that people forgot he was also showing what humanity could become. His divine nature was never meant to exclude us. It was meant to reflect the spark of the same divinity within everyone. His teaching of empowerment slowly turned into a faith of waiting rather than awakening. David felt a tremor in his chest, not anger this time, but recognition. So maybe it wasn't that everything I learned was false, he whispered, but that it was incomplete. That we were never meant to see ourselves as separate from God. Not entirely, the being said, and there was compassion in its mental voice. It served a purpose. Your species needed moral frameworks, community structures, a sense of something greater than individual survival. Religion provided that, but it also became restricted by fear and control. The tool became the prison, and now, 2,000 years later, humanity stands at a threshold between believing in divinity and realizing it. The being gestured and the projection showed Earth from space, beautiful and fragile. You have developed technology, science, an understanding of the physical world that Jesus could not have taught in his time. Your quantum physicists are beginning to discover what Jesus knew intuitively, that consciousness and matter are not separate, that the observer affects the observed, that reality is far more fluid and responsive than classical physics suggested. David's engineer mind latched onto this. The observer effect, quantum mechanics. You're saying Jesus understood this? He didn't understand it intellectually, the being replied. He lived it. He experienced it directly. He knew not through study but through direct knowing that consciousness creates reality. That thought is not passive but active. That belief literally shapes the quantum field and collapses possibilities into physical manifestation. The being moved to the center of the structure, and the projection changed again, this time showing molecular structures, waves of probability, quantum fields. Your scientists call it the collapse of the wave function, the moment when infinite possibility becomes singular reality, and they have discovered that consciousness plays a role in this collapse, but they have not yet made the full connection. Consciousness is not a byproduct of matter. Matter is a product of consciousness. David stared at the projection, his decades of scientific training trying to reconcile with what he was hearing. So, reality itself is created by consciousness? Reality is consciousness, the being said. Everything you see, touch, experience, it is all consciousness taking form. The universe is not a dead mechanical system. It is a living field of creative potential. And you are not separate from it. You are it, localized, individualized, given the illusion of separation so that consciousness can experience itself from infinite perspectives. David felt his worldview crumbling and rebuilding itself simultaneously. And Jesus understood this? Jesus lived this, the being corrected. He didn't just understand it intellectually, he embodied it. When he healed someone, he didn't ask God for permission. He simply held the absolute knowing that the person was already healed. He held no doubt, no alternative possibility, just pure, focused, unwavering certainty. And because consciousness creates reality, the body responded. The sickness dissolved, not because of divine intervention, but because of conscious creation. David took a deep breath, trying to ground himself. Show me more. If this is real, if this is how it works, show me. The being seemed to approve of this request. Very well. But understand, David, this is not something you can understand purely intellectually. You must experience it. You must practice it. You must prove it to yourself through direct demonstration. The projection changed again, showing a specific moment, Jesus standing before a man with a withered hand. Watch carefully, the being said. This event is recorded in your Bible, but the recording misses the most important detail. Watch Jesus' consciousness, not just his actions. David watched, and somehow through the projection, he could sense Jesus' mental state. There was no performance, no calling out to an external God, no dramatic gestures. Jesus simply looked at the man's hand, and in that look, David could feel it. Absolute certainty. Not hope that the hand would be healed, not faith that God might heal it, but complete, unshakable knowledge that the hand was already healed, that in the field of infinite potential, wholeness already existed, and all that was needed was to collapse that possibility into physical reality. And as Jesus held that certainty, the hand transformed. The withered tissue filled out, the fingers straightened, the skin regained its color, instantly, not gradually, not through some mysterious process, but instantly in response to the absolute certainty held in consciousness. Do you see? The being asked. Jesus did not ask God to heal this man. He did not perform a ritual. He simply knew with every fiber of his being that healing was the only possibility, and reality responded to that knowing. David felt something shift deep in his chest, a recognition, a remembering. So when he said, "You will do greater works than these," he meant exactly what he said, the being confirmed. You will do greater works, not because you will become more special than him, but because you will finally understand what he was demonstrating. You will recognize your own divine nature, your own creative power, and when enough humans understand this, when enough individuals wake up to their true nature, your species will transform in ways you cannot yet imagine. The being placed what might have been a hand on David's shoulder, and David felt warmth spread through his body. "This is why I am here, David. This is why you were drawn to this place. You are one of the ones who is ready. Your scientific mind, your understanding of systems and patterns, your loss of religious certainty, all of it, has prepared you to hear this truth without filtering it through dogma." David looked up at the being, his face still wet with tears. "What am I supposed to do with this? How do I even begin to—" "You begin by practicing," the being interrupted gently. "You begin by observing your thoughts, by understanding that every thought is a creative act, by learning to direct your consciousness intentionally rather than reactively. And you begin by proving it to yourself, not through faith, but through direct experience." The being gestured and a new projection appeared, showing what looked like layers of energy surrounding a human form. "You are not just a physical body, David. You are a multidimensional being. You have a conscious mind, the part you identify as you. You have a subconscious, which holds beliefs and patterns. And you have what some call a superconscious, the part of you that is directly connected to source consciousness, to what some call God." David studied the projection with his engineer's eye. So when Jesus healed, he was aligning all three levels. "Exactly," the being confirmed. His conscious mind held the intention. His subconscious had no conflicting beliefs, no hidden doubts. And his superconscious, his connection to source, was clear and unobstructed. When all three levels align, creation happens instantly. But when there is misalignment, when your conscious mind wants one thing but your subconscious believes another, you get mixed results or no results at all. The being moved closer to the projection. "This is why prayer often fails. People consciously ask for something, health, wealth, relationship, but subconsciously they believe they don't deserve it, or that it's impossible, or that God might say no. These conflicting beliefs cancel each other out. The quantum field receives mixed signals and produces ambiguous results." David nodded slowly, his mind beginning to grasp the mechanism. "So the key is alignment, getting all three levels to agree on the same reality." "Yes," the being said, "and this is what Jesus taught through his parables and demonstrations. Have faith. Believe you have received. Enter the feeling state of already having what you desire." These weren't religious platitudes. They were technical instructions for consciousness alignment. David felt a shift happening in him, a fundamental reorientation of his understanding. So faith isn't about believing in God. It's about believing in the reality you want to create. "Faith is absolute knowing," the being corrected. "It is certainty without evidence. It is holding a vision so completely that doubt cannot exist. And when you achieve that state, even for a moment, reality must respond. Because consciousness creates. That is the fundamental law." The being stepped back. "Now, David Brennan, I'm going to give you a practice. Something simple to start. And through this practice, you will prove to yourself that what I am telling you is not theory or mysticism. It is the actual operating principle of consciousness and reality." David straightened, ready to receive the instruction. "I'm listening." "For the next 7 days," the being said, "I want you to do one thing. Observe your thoughts without judgment. Notice what you think about. Notice the patterns. Notice how often your thoughts are focused on problems, on limitations, on what you don't want, rather than what you do want. Just observe. Do not try to change anything yet. Simply become aware." David felt a flicker of disappointment. "That's it? Just observe?" "It is more difficult than you imagine," the being replied. "Most humans live their entire lives without ever truly observing their thoughts. They are so identified with thinking that they cannot step back and see it objectively. But you must learn this skill, David, because you cannot change what you do not see. And you cannot direct your consciousness if you are unconscious of what your consciousness is doing." David nodded, accepting the wisdom in this. "And after 7 days?" "After 7 days, if you choose to continue, return here. I will be waiting, and we will go deeper into this teaching. You will learn to direct your thoughts intentionally. You will choose a small thing, something simple, and you will practice holding certainty around it, and you will watch as reality begins to respond." The being moved toward the opening in the structure. "But remember this, David. What I am teaching you is not new. It is ancient. It is what Jesus taught. It is what has been hidden for 2,000 years. And you must treat it with respect. This is not a party trick. This is not about manifesting cars or money for ego gratification. This is about remembering your true nature, about waking up to what you actually are, divine, creative, powerful beyond measure, and limited only by belief and limitation. David felt the weight of this knowledge settling into him. Why me? Of all the people in the world, why show this to me? The being's mental voice was gentle. Because you were ready. Because your heart, despite your scientific mind, remained open. Because you asked the right questions, even if you didn't know you were asking them. And because consciousness itself, the universe, recognized that it was time for you to wake up. David walked toward the opening, then turned back. Will I see you again? You will see me whenever you need to, the being said. But understand, I am not separate from you. I am an expression of the same consciousness you are. We are both individualized aspects of the infinite. And as you awaken more fully, you will realize that everything I have taught you exists within your own awareness. You do not need me. You need only to remember. David stepped out into the desert sunlight. He turned back once more, but the opening was already closing, the metal reforming seamlessly as if it had never been disturbed. He stood there for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face, trying to process everything that had just happened. Then he walked back to his truck, climbed in and sat there staring at the structure. After several minutes, he started the engine and began the long drive back to town. His mind was a chaos of thoughts, doubts, questions, and beneath it all, a growing sense of something that felt like hope, or perhaps remembering. The first 3 days of observation were harder than David had imagined. He discovered that his mind was a constant stream of negativity, worry, and limitation. Thoughts about money, always focused on what he didn't have. Thoughts about his age, about opportunities missed, about regrets. Thoughts about his late wife, tinged with guilt and sadness. The sheer volume of unconscious thinking was staggering, but David persisted. He set reminders on his phone. He carried a small notebook and made tick marks every time he caught himself in a negative thought pattern. By the end of the first day, he had over 100 marks. By the third day, the marks had decreased, not because he was thinking more positively, but because he was becoming more aware of the patterns before they fully formed. On the fourth day, something shifted. David was sitting on his porch with his morning coffee when he caught himself thinking about his late wife, Sarah. Normally, these thoughts were heavy with regret, with the feeling that he should have been there more, should have said things he never said. But this morning, for just a moment, he observed the thought without getting pulled into the emotion. He saw the memory arise, saw the sadness begin to form, and instead of diving into it, he simply watched it. And in that watching, something extraordinary happened. The emotion lost its grip. It was still there, but it didn't consume him. He felt the sadness, acknowledged it, and then it passed, like a cloud moving across the sky. And in its place was something else. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace. A recognition that he was not his thoughts, not his emotions. He was the awareness that observed them. That moment felt like cracking open a door he didn't know existed, and through that crack, light was streaming in. By the 7th day, David had developed a new relationship with his mind. He could see thoughts arising, could watch them like weather patterns, and he no longer believed every single one. This alone felt revolutionary. The constant mental chatter that had been his companion for 57 years was still there, but he was no longer imprisoned by it. He was the one observing it, and that made all the difference. On the morning of the 8th day, David loaded his truck and drove back to the desert. He felt different somehow, lighter, more present. The structure was exactly where he'd left it, and as he approached on foot, the opening appeared again, that impossible dissolution of solid matter into empty space. The being was waiting inside, and as David entered, he felt that same sense of expanded space, of being in a place that was somehow larger than its physical dimensions suggested. "You have done well," the being said, and David felt a warmth of approval wash through him. "You have begun to separate yourself from the thinking mind. This is essential, because now we begin the real work." The projection system activated, and David saw the familiar human form with its layers of energy. "Now," the being continued, "you will learn to direct your consciousness intentionally. We will start with something small. I want you to choose an object that you do not currently possess, but that would be meaningful to you. Not something expensive or difficult, something simple." David thought for a moment. "A book. There's a specific book I've wanted for years. It's out of print, rare. A first edition of a technical manual on early radio systems by one of the pioneers I admired. I've looked for it online a few times, but never committed to buying it from a rare book dealer. Perfect, the being said. Now, here is what you will do. Every morning for the next 7 days, sit quietly and visualize this book, but not as something you want. See it as something you already have. Feel the weight of it in your hands. See the cover. Smell the pages. Feel the satisfaction of owning it. Live in the reality where this book is already yours. The being moved closer, and David felt the intensity of its presence. And here is the most important part. You must feel the emotion of already having it. Not the wanting, not the hoping, but the satisfaction, the gratitude, the completeness of possession. Because emotion is what amplifies thought. Emotion is what takes a mental image and gives it the power to manifest in physical reality. David nodded, following the logic. And after I do this practice each morning? You release it, the being said firmly. You do not spend the rest of your day wondering when it will appear or how it will come. You do not check your email obsessively or search online again. You trust that the quantum field has received your signal and is rearranging circumstances to bring this into your reality. The moment you doubt, the moment you question, you send a contradictory signal, and the manifestation slows or stops entirely. David felt a flutter of anxiety. But what if it doesn't work? What if I do everything right and nothing happens? Then you will learn something valuable about your own hidden beliefs, the being said gently. But I assure you, if you do this correctly, if you truly inhabit the feeling state of already having this book, without doubt, without contradiction, something will happen. It may not happen exactly as you imagine. The universe is endlessly creative in how it delivers, but it will happen. Because this is law, David. Not hope, not possibility. Law. David left the structure that day with a strange mixture of excitement and skepticism. The rational part of his mind insisted this was absurd. But another part, the part that was growing stronger, whispered that maybe reality worked very differently than he'd been taught. The next morning, David sat in his quiet workshop before dawn and closed his eyes. He brought the image of the book to mind as clearly as he could. He saw the aged leather cover, the gold embossing of the title, the yellowed pages. He felt the weight of it in his hands, smelled that distinctive scent of old paper and binding glue. And then he did something that surprised him. He smiled. A genuine smile of satisfaction, as if the book really was sitting on a shelf at that very moment. He held that feeling for several minutes, letting it fill his body, letting it become real. And then, as instructed, he released it. He opened his eyes, stood up, and went about his day, and he did not think about the book again. On the third day, David received an email. It was from an old colleague, someone he hadn't heard from in over 5 years. The email was casual, friendly, catching up on life. And at the end, almost as an afterthought, the colleague mentioned that he was downsizing his personal library and wondered if David might be interested in any technical books on early radio systems. He was planning to donate most of them, but wanted to offer them to friends first. David's heart began to pound. He replied immediately, trying to keep his tone casual, asking what specific titles were available. The response came back within an hour, and there, in the list of available books, was the exact one David had been visualizing, the exact edition, the exact author, the exact title. David sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, his hands trembling. This could be coincidence. It had to be coincidence. But the timing, the specificity, the fact that he'd been visualizing this exact scenario for 3 days, it was too precise to dismiss. He accepted the offer. 3 days later, a package arrived. David opened it with shaking hands, and there it was. The book. Exactly as he'd visualized it. He held it, felt the weight, smelled the pages, and a wave of emotion washed over him that was almost overwhelming. Not just satisfaction at receiving the book, but something deeper. Recognition. Certainty. The understanding, visceral and undeniable, that what the being had taught him was real. He drove out to the desert that afternoon, not waiting for the scheduled meeting. The structure appeared as he approached, and the being seemed unsurprised to see him. "It worked," David said, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "I did exactly what you said, and it worked." "Of course it worked," the being replied, and David could sense something like affectionate amusement in its mental voice. "This is not magic, David. This is not mysticism. This is the operating system of consciousness and reality. You aligned your thought, your emotion, and your certainty. You sent a clear signal into the quantum field, and the field responded by rearranging circumstances to match that signal. This is how it always works. This is what Jesus understood. This is what he tried to teach. David sat down on the floor of the structure, still holding the book. But it was such a small thing. Jesus healed people. He walked on water. How do I go from manifesting a book to manifesting something significant? The principle is exactly the same, the being said. The only difference is the level of certainty you can hold without internal contradiction. With the book, you had no deep resistance. No part of you believed it was impossible. Your subconscious mind had no conflicting programming, so the manifestation happened quickly and easily. The being projected an image, showing layers of belief structures in the human psyche, like geological strata. But with something like healing your own body or manifesting significant wealth, humans carry deep programming, beliefs inherited from parents, from society, from religious teaching, beliefs that say, I don't deserve this, or this is impossible, or only special people can do this. Those beliefs are barriers. They send contradictory signals, and the quantum field receives mixed messages. David studied the projection, his engineer's mind processing the information like a systems diagram. So the work isn't just learning the technique, it's clearing the subconscious obstacles. Exactly, the being confirmed. And this is why the second teaching was never just about technique. It was about transformation, about recognizing yourself as divine. Because when you truly, deeply understand that you are an expression of source consciousness, that you are not separate from God, many limiting beliefs dissolve automatically. They cannot coexist with that level of self-recognition. The being looked at David intently. This is what Jesus meant when he said you are gods, not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. You carry the same creative power he demonstrated, the same ability to collapse quantum possibilities into physical reality. The only difference between Jesus and the average human is not the power available. It's the level of awareness and the absence of limiting beliefs. Over the following weeks and months, David continued his practice under the being's guidance. Each time he returned to the structure, he was given a new assignment, something to manifest, something to practice. And each time he was pushed slightly beyond his comfort zone, asked to create something that required a little more faith, a little more certainty, a little less doubt. He manifested unexpected income, small amounts at first, then larger. He manifested repairs to his truck that he couldn't afford, only to have a mechanic friend offer to do the work for free because he needed practice on that particular model. He manifested solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable. And with each successful manifestation, his certainty grew. His understanding deepened. His limiting beliefs began to dissolve. But more than the external manifestations, David was changing internally. The chronic low-level anxiety that had been his constant companion for years was fading. The sense of being a victim of circumstance was replaced by a growing understanding of his own creative agency. He was beginning to see his thoughts not as passive observations of reality, but as active instructions to the quantum field. The being taught him about the 3 levels of consciousness alignment: the conscious mind, which sets intention; the subconscious mind, which holds beliefs and must be clear of contradiction; and the superconscious, the connection to source, which must be unobstructed by doubt or fear. When Jesus healed, the being explained during one session, all 3 levels were perfectly aligned. His conscious intention was clear: heal this person. His subconscious held no belief that healing was impossible or that he was unworthy to perform it, and his superconscious connection to source was wide open, unobstructed by fear or doubt. In that perfect alignment, manifestation was instantaneous. David practiced this alignment daily, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But even the failures taught him something. They revealed hidden beliefs, subconscious programming he didn't know he carried. And slowly, methodically, he worked through these obstacles. One evening, about 3 months after his first encounter with the being, David sat on his porch watching the sunset, and he had a profound realization. He wasn't praying anymore. Not in the traditional sense. He wasn't asking an external God for help or guidance. Instead, he was having a direct dialogue with his own higher consciousness, with the part of him that was connected to Source. And in that dialogue, he wasn't pleading or begging. He was affirming, declaring, creating. For the first time in his 57 years, David felt powerful. Not in an egotistical sense, but in a deep, grounded recognition of his own creative authority. He understood finally what Jesus had been trying to teach. You are not separate from God. You are an expression of divine consciousness. And through conscious alignment of thought, emotion, and belief, you shape your experience of reality. The being had called this the second covenant, the teaching that came after faith, the recognition that you don't need to pray to an external God, because God is not external. God is the creative consciousness that you are. And prayer, real prayer, is not asking someone else to fix your life. It's affirming the reality you choose to experience and then allowing the quantum field to rearrange itself to match that affirmation. As David's understanding deepened, he began to see the implications. If this teaching had been preserved, if humanity had understood this 2,000 years ago, how different would the world be? No religions built on guilt and unworthiness. No institutions claiming authority over people's connection to the divine. No waiting for salvation from an external source. Just billions of humans recognizing their own creative power and consciously shaping their collective reality. On a crisp morning in late winter, almost 6 months after his first encounter, David made his regular journey to the structure. But this time, when he entered, the being seemed different. There was a quality to its presence that David couldn't quite name, a sense of completion, perhaps, or preparation for something significant. David Brennan, the being said, and its mental voice carried a weight that made David pay close attention. You have learned the basics. You have experienced conscious creation firsthand. You understand the mechanics of how thought shapes reality. But now we must address something deeper, the final piece of the second covenant. David felt his pulse quicken. I'm ready. The question I am about to ask you will determine whether you truly understand what Jesus taught, or if you are still operating from the old paradigm. The being paused, and the air in the structure seemed to grow heavier. David, when you create your reality, when you manifest something, who is doing the creating? David opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. This was a trap, he realized, or rather a test. He thought carefully before responding. I am, but not the small I, the ego, the I that is connected to everything, the I that is consciousness itself, localized. Yes, the being said, and David felt approval wash through him. And this is the ultimate truth of the second covenant. You are not separate from Source. When you create, you are not asking Source to create for you. You are Source creating through this particular point of awareness. There is no separation. There never was. The being moved closer, and David felt energy flowing between them. Jesus understood this completely. When he said I and the Father are one, he was not claiming unique divinity. He was stating a truth that applies to every conscious being. You and the Father are one. You and Source consciousness are one. You and creative power are one. The separation is an illusion, necessary for individual experience, but ultimately false. The being gestured, and the projection showed Earth again, but this time David could see it differently. He could see streams of light connecting every living thing, a vast network of consciousness experiencing itself through billions of individual perspectives. This is what Jesus tried to show humanity, the being said, that you are not small, separate beings trying to appease a distant God. You are God, experiencing reality through human form. You are Source consciousness, exploring what it means to be limited, to be individual, to be embodied. And the moment you recognize this, truly recognize it, limitation dissolves, because you realize that the only limits are the ones you believe in. David felt tears streaming down his face as the full weight of this truth settled into him. So the second covenant isn't just about manifestation techniques. It's about identity, about who we truly are. Yes, the being confirmed. The first teaching, the one preserved in your religions, was about faith, trust. Believe in something greater than your physical senses. This was necessary. Humanity needed to develop that capacity. But it was never meant to be the final teaching. It was meant to prepare you for the second revelation, that the something greater you were learning to trust is actually you, your true nature, your divine essence. The being placed its hand on David's chest, and David felt warmth spreading through his entire body. Jesus tried to give this teaching, David. He said it clearly. The kingdom of God is within you. You will do greater works than these. You are God's. But the world wasn't ready. They made him into the exception rather than the example. They worshipped him instead of learning from him. They built religions around him instead of following his actual instruction. Which was? David asked, though he thought he knew the answer. Wake up, the being said simply. Remember what you are. Stop giving your power to external authorities. Stop waiting for salvation. Stop praying to a distant God. Recognize that you are the creator of your experience, that your thoughts shape your reality, that your consciousness is not separate from source consciousness. And when you truly understand this, when you live from this understanding, you become what Jesus demonstrated, a conscious creator, a being who shapes reality through intentional thought rather than unconscious reaction. The being stepped back. This is why I was sent, David. Not just to teach you, but to help you remember, to show you what was hidden, to deliver the second covenant that Jesus tried to give, because your species is ready now. Not everyone, but enough. Enough individuals are awakening to shift the collective consciousness, and you are one of them. David felt the weight of responsibility, but also a strange sense of rightness. What happens now? What am I supposed to do with this knowledge? You live it, the being said simply. You practice it. You demonstrate it through your own transformation. And when people notice, when they ask how you've changed, you tell them. Not by preaching, not by creating another religion, but by sharing what you've learned, by teaching the techniques, by helping others remember their own divine nature. The being moved toward the wall of the structure. Our time together is coming to an end, David. You have learned what you needed to learn. Now you must integrate it, practice it, live it, and trust that the universe will bring to you those who are ready to hear this teaching. David stood, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. Will I see you again? You will see me whenever you truly need to, the being replied. But understand this. I am not separate from you. I am an expression of the same consciousness you are. We are both individualized aspects of the infinite. And as you continue to awaken, you will realize that everything I have taught you exists within your own awareness. You don't need me. You never did. You only needed to remember. The opening in the structure appeared, and David walked toward it, then paused and turned back one final time. Thank you for everything, for showing me what was hidden, for helping me remember who I truly am. You are welcome, the being said, and David felt immense love radiating from it. But remember this above all else. Jesus didn't come to save you. He came to remind you that you were never lost. You were always whole, always divine, always creative. You just forgot. And now, you are remembering. Live from that remembrance, David Brennan, and help others remember when they are ready. David stepped out into the desert morning. The sun was just rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He turned back toward the structure, and as he watched, it began to fade. Not disappearing suddenly, but gradually becoming less solid, less present, until it was gone completely, as if it had never existed. But David knew better. It had been real. All of it had been real. And he carried the proof not in physical evidence, but in the fundamental transformation of his consciousness. He understood now what he truly was. Not a small, separate being struggling through an indifferent universe, but an expression of source consciousness itself, creating his reality through thought, belief, and intentional focus. He walked back to his truck, climbed in, and sat there for a long moment, feeling the morning sun warm his face. Then he started the engine and began the drive back to town, back to his life, back to the world. But everything had changed. He had changed, and that change would ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Over the months that followed, David's life continued to transform. Not in dramatic lightning bolt ways, but in a steady, undeniable shift in his experience of reality. Money flowed more easily, health improved, relationships deepened, opportunities appeared. And through it all, David practiced what he'd learned, observing his thoughts, directing his consciousness, aligning his 3 levels of awareness, living from the understanding that he was not separate from creative source. People began to notice. His neighbor Sarah was the first to ask about the change she saw in him. Then others followed, a friend struggling with chronic illness, a former colleague facing financial collapse. People who were ready to stop seeing themselves as victims and start recognizing themselves as creators. David taught them what he had learned. Not the story of the alien being or the structure in the desert. Those details would only distract. But the core teaching, the second covenant. You are not separate from God. You are an expression of creative consciousness. And through conscious alignment of thought, emotion, and belief, you shape your experience of reality. Some people grasped it immediately. They practiced, saw results, and their lives transformed. Others struggled, too attached to their victimhood, too identified with their limitations. David learned not to push. He offered the teaching to those who were ready and trusted that everyone would awaken in their own time. One student in particular, a man named Michael, who had been battling severe depression for years, had a breakthrough that reminded David of his own transformation. After 6 weeks of practice, Michael called David late one night, his voice filled with wonder. "I finally understand," Michael said. "I've been trying to use these techniques to fix my depression, but tonight I realized that's still the old paradigm. I'm still seeing myself as broken. But the real teaching isn't about fixing yourself. It's about recognizing you were never broken. The depression is just a habitual thought pattern. And I can choose different patterns, not because I'm repairing something, but because I'm creating consciously." David felt tears in his eyes as he listened. Yes, exactly. You're not healing yourself. You're remembering yourself. And it connects to what you said about Jesus, Michael continued. He wasn't healing bodies. He was reminding people of the wholeness that already existed in consciousness. The sickness was just a temporary forgetting, and the moment they remembered, their bodies responded. As months turned into years, David's understanding continued to deepen. He wasn't just teaching manifestation techniques. He was helping people remember their true nature. And that remembering, that awakening, was the real second covenant, not a set of rules or rituals, not a new religion, but a fundamental recognition of human divine nature. David often thought about the being, about the structure, about that pivotal encounter that had shattered and rebuilt his understanding of reality. And he realized the being had been right. He didn't need it anymore. Everything he'd been taught existed within his own consciousness. The being had simply been a mirror, reflecting back what David had forgotten about himself. On the 4th anniversary of his first encounter, David drove out to the desert one final time. The structure was not there, and he hadn't expected it to be, but he stood in the place where it had been, feeling the desert wind on his face, and he spoke aloud, knowing somehow that the being would hear. "Thank you for showing me the truth. Thank you for helping me remember. I understand now what Jesus was teaching. I understand the second covenant, and I promise, for whatever time I have left, I will live this truth. I will demonstrate it, and I will help others remember when they're ready." The wind picked up, carrying his words across the empty landscape, and David felt, not with his ears but with his heart, a familiar presence. "You were always ready, David Brennan. You just needed permission to remember. Now go. Live. Create. And trust that every moment is consciousness knowing itself through you. This is the truth Jesus taught. This is the truth we helped you remember. And this is the truth that will, slowly but inevitably, transform your world." David smiled, wiped tears from his face, and walked back to his truck. His life had purpose now beyond anything he'd experienced during his NASA years. He was part of humanity's awakening, the remembering of the second covenant, the recognition that divinity is not external, but internal, not distant, but immediate, not reserved for prophets, but inherent in every human being. He drove back to town, back to his small house, back to his workshop where he would continue his practice and meet with those ready to learn. And as he drove, he understood what the being had meant when it said consciousness had called them. Humanity was ready. Not everyone at once, not in some dramatic collective shift, but person by person, individual by individual, souls who had grown weary of powerlessness and were ready to remember their true nature. The second covenant was no longer hidden. It was emerging. And David Brennan, retired NASA engineer, would spend the rest of his life helping others discover what he had learned. That consciousness creates reality. That thought is not passive, but powerfully creative. That you are not separate from Source, but an expression of it. And that the kingdom of heaven, the realm of infinite creative potential, is not somewhere distant. It is within you. It always has been. You just forgot. And now, finally, it's time to remember.